project, which highlights the consumer perceptions of how their CR assets are coordinated. This is, of course, a topic central to market design today and into the future. For example, in 30 years or so, as highlighted or in line with the AEMO's step change scenario, this envisages market saturation of solar PV and electric vehicles by this time. In Victoria as well, we need to remember that we'll also expect full electrification of gas devices as well. In doing this, we need to identify which path we'll take and that can fairly and effectively leverage what role consumers and their CER resources can play for both their own benefit, but also for the system that they're connected to. This is integral into the future that we're heading down towards. In addition to Josh today, we'll be joined by James Seymour, CEO of C4Net. He'll provide a broader context of the Enhanced System Planning project and the role of CR and its coordination. Following these presentations, we'll be joined by a panel of experts who will explore what we know, the gaps and the opportunities in how we understand and work with consumers and their assets now and into the future. If you do have some questions during the presentations or through the moderated discussion, pop your questions in the Q&A control box in the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen, and I'll address these with the panel in the open Q&A session. Now, if you can please welcome James Seymour.
Thanks a lot, Janine, and thank you all for joining us here today. In the Enhanced System Planning project, we have the privilege of looking into the long-term future of the Australian energy landscape. While there is a lot of uncertainty in any long-term thinking, other elements are highly likely, and this is what Janine touched on with the mass electrification and the shift to renewable generation. The grid of 20 to 30 years in the future is fundamentally different. The grid of the future is fundamentally different in that adjacent storage is abundant through EVs alone, but how accessible that will be will depend on consumer behaviour, system and market design and regulations. Using what we know today, there is much that we can picture in terms of how certain scenarios may play out. Near-term policy choices are likely to have a material impact on the likelihood of which scenarios are more likely to play out. The impact of these necessitates a modernised approach to energy system planning and operation, and the thinking is critical to informing policy and regulatory choices that will shape the grids and markets of the future, including how consumers interact with them. We've seen recently energy ministers, AEMO and others recognise this gap in the forecasting and system planning, and the need for enhanced insights into distributed energy resources, consumer energy demand in distribution networks, and options for asset coordinations. One of the really challenging gaps to fill is how to broadly factor constrained distribution grid thinking, consumer investment choices and behaviour into that whole of system planning. The ESP aims to address these challenges by developing new methodologies to help refine Australia's energy planning framework beyond 2030, looking right out to the full saturation, so looking 2050 and beyond. ESP was co-created by a number of universities, distribution network service providers, Energy Consumers Australia, the Australian Gas Infrastructure Group, iMove Australia, and Race for 2030, together with the Victorian Government and AEMO. This collaborative approach is a real key feature of the ESP because these are big challenges that have not been tackled before. Today's webinar is the first in a series of exploring the relevance of ESP research to current debates in energy policy, market design and system planning. Josh and our panellists will explore how innovative strategies can both create value for consumers, transform the grid and enhance energy resilience through coordination of consumer energy assets. Consumer assets are rapidly growing and will be a huge source of energy generation and storage. To what extent they work with the grid and balance both communal and individual needs will depend on how they are operated, with enormous impact on the energy market and grid operation. As some of today's speakers have recently reported, effective coordination can deliver efficient and low-cost energy for the whole economy, both during and after the transition to net zero emissions. Understanding consumer preferences, choices, impacts and engagement is important. Do they understand the impacts of coordination or the lack of it, and what either pathway delivers for them? If consumers aren't on board, then the decisions that impact them, that challenge gets much, much harder, and our energy system needs to adapt to the ways that in which consumers will all generate, store, and use energy. We're not here to advocate any specific solution. The research aims to inform the debate, providing detailed insights into the outcomes and the implications of different modes of coordination. And what consumers think today will no doubt evolve as mass electrification and EV adoption becomes the norm. While it's super hard to predict thinking in the future, what Josh and his team know of today helps us understand enacting nearer-term policy choices and how they would be received. It's also clear that when practices can be designed with minimal impact on consumers, there's little resistance or issue in broad adoption. Consider the 20% of Victorians using overnight hot water heaters controlled by a third party today. We hope today's webinar and the ESP project overall can help inform these decisions, and we thank you for joining us for the conversation. With that context in mind, I'd like to hand over to Joshua Newton from Deakin University. Josh will introduce his research on fairly integrating distributed energy resources into the NEM and consumers' policy perceptions. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, James. And Louise will be sharing some slides in a couple of moments for everyone. Before I get started, though, just wanted to give, first of all, a big shout out to the whole Better Consumption Lab team at Deakin University, who's really helping to support this particular piece of research. Although I am presenting it today, there are a large number of people that stand behind me that were helping to oversee and to run the various findings that I'll be presenting in a few moments. Also, a big shout out to the C4Net team as well for all of their advice and support across a very extended period of time, most particularly for the research that I'll be going through now. So without any further ado, we were focusing upon perceptions of two broad policies that could intersect with consumer energy resources. And for the avoidance of doubt, I think it's really clear for probably most of the people on the call today what I'm referring to when I refer to consumer energy resources. But just in case you are less familiar with this terminology, we're effectively talking here about devices that can store, that can generate, or which can time shift your energy, whether that be rooftop PVs, EVs, as well as also for electric appliances that can time shift their use, such as electric space heating and electric water heating. Now, I'm just going to share the slides separately. Here we go. So the first of the particular policies that we were looking at was around third-party control of consumer energy resources. And we were focusing particularly around a broad challenge that we've identified in some of our research to date. When we have looked at and chatted with consumers previously about consumer energy resources, one of the common themes that comes through, particularly in our qualitative interview, is this real desire for control. Consumers are wanting to have some form of control over their CER. And that makes a huge amount of sense when you think about the thousands of dollars that have typically been paid out of their own pocket to be able to support the purchase of these assets. What is less clear is about the particular desired level of control that consumers are looking for. Are they wanting full control where they can complete everything and have complete control over how their CER operates and how it intersects with the grid? Are they looking for partial control where they can set a broad preference for how their CER operates, but which is then, those preferences are then enacted by a third party? Or are they looking for energy as a service where they don't necessarily have the direct control of the asset per se, but they have guaranteed access to the benefits that their CER can actually deliver? So that was one of the things that we were particularly interested in unpacking. What was ultimately their desired level of control? And to do this, not just at a whole of CER perspective, but to really break it down on a technology by technology basis. The second challenge that we were really interested in understanding is whether these preferences for control were sensitive to, once consumers have further information, whether these desire for control would start to shift. We know, for example, that as control for CER increases, so too will potentially the need for additional network upgrades to ensure that there is sufficient capacity for the CER to operate at the desire of consumers. And that might be fine, but it will also then mean that there will be flow-on impacts in terms of energy bill increases, as we would need to expand out the grid infrastructure to support that control. So too would the need for additional energy bill increases in the future to be able to support that expansion. And so to what extent are consumers prepared to trade off their desired level of control to be able to minimize future potential energy bill increases? And that was the second thing that we were particularly interested in understanding. So to answer these two particular components, we surveyed almost or a little over 1,400 people in May and June of this year. And really important, I think, just to understand who it was that we surveyed, because obviously that has impacts in terms of how you contextualize and interpret the results. The respondents that we surveyed resided in Victoria. They lived in freestanding houses or townhouses, duplexes, and they owned their home outright or with a mortgage. They were also the joint or main decision maker for choosing energy products or services for their household. So in other words, we did not survey renters, nor did we survey those who were living in flats or apartments. And the reason for this is, and I'll get to the results in a little bit later, in a few minutes' time with the presentation, we were also looking at desire for adoption of CER. And it's much more difficult for consumers to be able to adopt CER if they don't own their own premises or if they're living in flats or apartments, depending upon which CER we're talking about. So to the results themselves, what we did is we looked at three particular CER. We looked at EV charging, we looked at electric space heating, and we looked at electric water heating. And for each of these technologies, we asked consumers whether they were wanting to have full control, partial control, or to have energy as a service type offering for those particular technologies. The full wording for what we presented to participants is available in our broader report, which will be released through C4Net. And I really do encourage you, if you are interested in these findings, please do engage with the report. It has a heap of additional information and analysis that I won't be able to get to in the presentation today. But what we can see here is that their baseline preferences across each of these technologies very much indicated that consumers had a general desire to maximize control of their CER, which probably won't be of much of a surprise to many of the people in the webinar here today. If we were to look at the three different options, we can see that typically the most preferred option was for full control. Consumers were wanting to have every element of control that they could possibly muster for this technology so that they could determine how it would be used and at what time it would be used, with partial control coming in as sometimes a distant second, depending upon the technology, sometimes as a close second, and in one instance as the preferred option. Energy as a service, it did not receive a huge amount of baseline support. We were looking at single-digit preferences for this as being the most preferred option. What we then did, though, is that once we asked participants to identify their preferred level of control, we then provided some additional information. We first of all painted the picture that depending upon the amount of control that consumers were looking for their CER, it would then potentially mean that there might be further increases to electricity bills in the future to be able to support the build out of the grid to facilitate full and complete control. What we also did is we provided an indication as to the relative cost increases that might be expected for full control versus partial control versus energy as a service. We were indicating, for example, that full control would give rise to the greatest bill increases, that energy as a service would give rise to the least amount of bill increases, with partial control having an intermediate level of bill increase. It would have been beautiful to have been able to articulate what the size of those bill increases would have been, but obviously it's very difficult to provide that level of information, not only by virtue of the fact that everyone's energy requirements differ sometimes quite substantially, but also in terms of what this might look like over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so this was very much just a high-level heuristic to give a sense that there would be different levels of bill increase required depending upon what the ultimate level of control was that consumers were preferring. This is what started to happen once we had provided that level of information. And I'm just providing the example here for electric space heating. I'll get to the aggregate results in the next slide, but I think it paints a little bit of a picture as to where the flows were starting to go for consumers' preferences for control once they had some further contextualization of the potential cost-related impacts for control. So for electric space heating, it was far and away the preferred option was for full control pre-explanation, with 61% preferring full control. After we had provided that explanation, after we provided that additional contextual information, we saw that the preference for full control dropped to 24%. It became the third preferred option. Partial control went from the second most preferred option to the first preferred option, an increase from 32% to 48%. And energy as a service had the greatest percentage increase, going from 7%, a very distant third when we hadn't provided that information, to an increase of 28% to become the second preferred option. When we start to look at these across all of the technologies, we see a similar picture, that partial control was the preferred option, energy as a service typically coming in as the second preferred option, although electric water heating was the potential variation from that, and then full control being the third most preferred option. So what can we really tell from this set of results? What this looks at and what this is painting a picture of is that consumers are price sensitive. They're looking to try to minimize their future energy bills. And that if we as a sector can start to paint a picture about how control to CER intersects with the need for build out of further network capacity, and with it, that there would be future increases in electricity bills over and above what would be otherwise required to help to transition the sector to decarbonize forms of energy generation, that we can then start to see shifts in the preferences that consumers are wanting to have for their CER assets. They aren't necessarily wanting to forego all elements of control. They're still wanting to have an element of control, as we can see with partial control being the preferred option. But the way that I sort of try to have this as a bit of an analogy is that this is almost an indication of the same style of control that consumers are familiar with in terms of their superannuation schemes, that they aren't necessarily getting into the weeds of being responsible for every single transaction that's taking place to support their superannuation, but they can at the same time still have some high-level settings to be able to inform the type of investment profile and the type of risk profile that would be sitting alongside their superannuation contributions. And this, I think, is broadly consistent with what we're looking at here today. Consumers are wanting to have some degree of control, but they're not necessarily wanting to get well and truly into the weeds to be responsible for every element, especially once they start to be familiar with the broader energy bill related implications of CER control. The second element that we looked at in terms of this survey was how best to manage the import and export of energy for consumer energy resources. Again, to paint a little bit of picture, although I think I provide a little bit of this implicitly in my introduction a few moments ago for the previous piece. But as we have more CERs being adopted, each of these CERs are going to be interfacing with the grid in various ways. And that can, depending upon the time of day and depending upon what else is happening within the broader sector, have potential strain that's starting to emerge in terms of the grid. There might be too much supply, there may not be sufficient demand. All of those different elements need to be managed to ensure that we're able to maintain a really stable and secure grid. And so there are two potential broad families of approaches that could be implemented to really try to manage this issue. The first would be some form of mandated mechanism, which would be the introduction, for example, of import and export focused dynamic operating envelopes, which would constrain or expand the amount of energy that CERs could import or export to the grid, depending upon the broader dynamics that are happening on the grid. In other words, as a function of the supply and demand of energy that's taking place more broadly. The other option would be some form of market-based mechanism where tariff reform would allow for two-way pricing such that prices for imports and exports of electricity, the prices attached to those would vary as a function of network supply and demand. And what we're particularly interested in trying to understand in further detail is how consumers would view and perceive these two different approaches. So what we did, and again, in the full report, it goes through exactly what we presented to participants and the level of detail that we're able to provide. But what we did is we presented our participant groups with one of these two scenarios. So in other words, they were randomly presented with only one of the scenarios, because we're really interested in looking at their overall absolute evaluation as opposed to a relativistic evaluation between these two scenarios. And what we found here is that the market-based mechanism was viewed in an overall weakly positive manner. If we look at the particular breakdown of their responses, we had about 40% of our participants viewing the market-based mechanism in either a somewhat or very positive manner, compared with 29% who were somewhat or very positive about the mandated mechanism. This wasn't an overwhelmingly or universally positively viewed approach. However, we can see that we've got about 35% of our respondents who were neutral with respect to their evaluation of the market-based mechanism, and we had 26% who were somewhat or very negative. So the way that I interpret this is that it's a form of begrudging acceptance. We've got some people who are a little bit more positively inclined to it, some people who are somewhat disinclined towards it, and we've got about a third of participants, a third of consumers who are sitting somewhere in the midpoint where they're neutral. Very swayable, in other words, depending upon what might start to happen over the months and years ahead. We can also start to break it down by different consumer segments, and we've got lots of different segmentation-based analyses in the final report. What I presented here, though, is for one of the variables that I think is particularly useful, and that's around adopter category status. So for those that are not familiar with it, adopter categories came about in the 60s as a result of a researcher called Everett Rogers, who was looking at the diffusion of innovations around a whole form of different technologies. And I think that the brilliance of his insights is that he was understanding that where people are in terms of their likelihood to adopt would vary as a function of other broader categories of variables, of their innovativeness, of their propensity for risk, of their propensity towards conservative sort of evaluations of new innovations and technologies. And the reason why it's useful for us to look at this here is that any form of market-based reform that we do to support CER will in turn have broader implications for adoption of CER more broadly, because obviously that's something that we're needing to be able to manage as well over the next couple of decades to be able to help decarbonize the grid. And so what we can see here is that for the market-based mechanism, the only adopted category who were seeing this in an overall and universally negative view were the laggards. In other words, the people who are the very last two, or the very last who are likely to adopt low emission technologies. The other adopted categories, the innovators, early adopters, early majority, and late majority, were all neutral or broadly speaking positive in terms of their evaluation of the market-based mechanism. The mandated mechanism had much greater variability. The innovators and the early adopters were seeing this in a more positive manner, but the early majority, late majority, and laggards were seeing this in a negative manner. Now, overall evaluations and attitudes are one thing. We were also particularly keen to understand perceptions of fairness. How were people looking at these two particular mechanisms, and was one seen as being fairer than the other? And what we found is that the mandated mechanism was seen as being more unfair than fair. We had 26% of our respondents who were viewing this as being somewhat or very fair. We had almost 50%, about half of our sample, who were seeing it as being either somewhat or very unfair. And so there was certainly a very marked discrepancy in terms of those perceptions of fairness for the mandated mechanism. If we compare and contrast that with the market-based mechanism, we've got 40% of our respondents who are seeing it as somewhat or very fair, and we've got 37% who are seeing it as being somewhat or very unfair. It's a similar pattern to what we saw for the overall evaluation in terms of opinion with respect to the adopted category status and those perceptions of fairness. We can see that there's much greater variability for the perceptions of the fairness of the mandated mechanism, with the early majority, late majority, and laggards seen as being unfair overall, with more neutral evaluations of fairness amongst the innovators and the early adopters. One thing that we were also keen on understanding is if these particular mechanisms were rolled out, to what extent that would start to inform people's broader likelihood to engage with and to adopt low emission technologies more broadly, because we're wanting to obviously have any policy mechanism to be rolled out. We need to be conversant with and understanding that it could have potential downstream implications for anything else that intersects with the electricity grid, such as electric-based low emission technologies. And so what I've got up here are a few different adoption stats, which I'll quickly go through to help you understand what you're looking at. For the electric space heating adoption, which is the figures up here on the screen, we had 60% of those assigned to the market-based mechanism and 58% of those in the mandated mechanism who had already adopted some form of electric space heating adoption. Doesn't mean that it was necessarily universal. They may have had other forms of heating that were also present within their home, but they had at least one form of low emission technology sitting within their house. We then also asked them what their likelihood to adopt would be over the next 5 years, which is that business as usual type adoption. And we can see that for both groups, there was an additional 12% on top of the existing current adoption rates who would be likely to switch to low emission technologies for electric space heating over the next 5 years. But once we presented the policy and once we said, assume this policy had been enacted, what would be your intention to adopt electric space heating in the next 5 years? We actually saw a drop in terms of that business as usual type adoption intention. It was a drop of 5% for the market-based mechanism. It was a drop of 7% for the mandated mechanism. And I think what this broadly points to is that when we are making market-based reforms, we must be particularly sensitive to the broader implications it might have for our desire to facilitate and to accelerate the adoption of low emission technologies as quickly as possible. I don't want to overinterpret this finding though, because although we found significant differences here for electric space heating, we found no significant differences in adoption intentions for either EVs or for electric water heating. It wasn't a significant increase, it wasn't a significant decrease, it was effectively unchanged. And I think this speaks to the fact, and this is perhaps because it's a Victorian sample and it was done over May and June, people are mindful of heat and are wanting to ensure that they've got warm houses. And so there may have been some particular sensitivity about really trying to ensure that they would be able to maintain access to a warm house, which perhaps explains some of the specifics for this technology, as opposed to seeing a similar pattern across all the low emission technologies that we're looking at. Parting thought before I hand back to Janine for the broader panel conversation is that it may not always be possible to introduce market-based mechanisms to facilitate and to really allow for all the things that we need to do to bring CER online and to be able to interact with the grid. So even though our results paint a pretty strong picture that of the two, market-based mechanisms are preferred to the mandated mechanisms, technical issues mean that it may not necessarily always be feasible. We can't put all of our eggs into the market-based mechanism basket because there are factors that could preclude that, or where there might be other elements that will need to come into play to really ensure that we can have CER interacting with the grid. And in that particular context, it would be useful for further research to paint out a picture as to whether further contextual information can really start to have an impact in terms of preferences for CER control. Similar to what we did for the CER control, if we were to provide further information, would that start to shift their perceptions of the mandated mechanism, and would that start to shift how people were perceiving it? So I'm going to put a pause there and hand across to Janine now to facilitate the broader panel conversation.
Hi, Josh. Thanks so much. And I think everyone can already tell that that piece of research is really valuable, leading us into where we need to go into the future and to think more deeply around where consumers and their expectations and perceptions are sitting. And that also sets us up really well for the panel discussion that we're about to launch into. Everyone, you're welcome to put your cameras on now if you like, and I'll introduce the panelists as we go from here. So we'd like to introduce Brian. Brian is the Director of the Energy Systems Transition at Energy Consumers Australia. Welcome, Brian, and thank you for participating today. Con Christodoulides is the Acting Chief Policy Impact and Acting Chief Policy and Impact Lead at the Clean Energy Council. This is a new acting role for Con, so I'm just getting up to date with the change in his position and title. And welcome Andrew Lewis, the Executive General Manager of Consumer Markets and Analytics at the Australian Energy Market Commission. We really appreciate and really want to engage in the discussion today with you all. And thanks again for Josh for being part of this and with your research. So I'd like to now commence the discussion on what we really hope will lead us into what we need to do to think between now and 30 years into the future. We are really casting forward, and it really is difficult. Even with Josh's research, consumers can't really see much beyond where they are now. And so we've got to do some of that lifting for them to think through what we need to do to get an energy system that will work for them and their resources and the energy system in the next 30 years. What I will do is, so reflecting again on the ISP and our research, we do rely very heavily on the consumer energy resources as a solution as a part of that. I want to reflect on that as we go through the panel discussion and how we make the system work for everyone. So I'll just start with the questions. Brian, I'll start with you, but I will take this question to all the panelists. I do want to get your sense of what the most important insights were from Josh's presentation and why, and where that trade-off might sit between consumer agency and the system that we're working with.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Janine. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of great outcomes from Josh's research. I guess a few of the things that really struck me is maybe the most important one was actually that last slide around the reduction in take up the reduction in adoption numbers in electric space heating. I think one of the things I often think about when I think about these new technologies and consumer uptake of electric heating, electric vehicles, rooftop solar, even though that wasn't analyzed, is that oftentimes the greatest benefit, both for the consumer and for sort of broader society or even the energy system, however we want to look at it, is simply the purchase of the technology. The behavioral bit, also valuable and important, but less important potentially than just the investment up front. And the fact that the way that we design and talk about control and the way that the system will interact with these technologies changes the way people perceive their willingness to go out and invest. I think is something that's like really should cause us all to pause and think more centrally about the way that we're designing the system and then communicating that design to consumers so that they really understand what's what they should do and what's in it for them. I think I'm stealing from someone overseas who paraphrased JFK when he said, ask not what, sometimes it feels like it's ask not what your utility can do for you, but what you can do for your utility. And like fundamentally, I think we have to remember that the energy system exists to help consumers. Like it is there to power our devices and technologies, not the other way around. And so like fundamentally, we need to make sure that the system works for all of everybody's kit, and that becomes a more complicated task as we electrify everything, because there is a greater reliance upon electricity and all of the costs and impacts that we're aware of, come with that. But anyway, I think it's super helpful to have additional insights into consumers in the way that they perceive the different type of mechanisms and offers that might be made to them.
Thanks, Brian. Andrew, would just be interested in your perceptions of the work that Josh has done and the insights that he's raised.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. I think probably the apart from obviously the presentation of the data and the results, the biggest sort of takeaway for me, looking at what Josh and the team have presented, is the importance of education and information for consumers, and the role that plays in helping to shift what are very natural but potentially more limited initial viewpoints when it comes to the investment or the decisions around particularly taking on new technology, but also the lack of awareness of the broader opportunities that exist. So the understanding how we can continue to improve knowledge sharing, information awareness to allow overall better information is to me one of the key things that I've taken away from what Josh has presented.
Thanks, Andrew. And that then leads you to Con, some recent work that the Clean Energy Council have done around that might be of value and interest here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. It's fairly similar to what Andrew said, that we did some work looking at how to increase the uptake of consumer energy resources by consumers. So not looking at what we need to do on the supply side to get these resources connected and working and functioning well in the market, but what would encourage consumers to actually go out there and make that purchase. And the key thing we found was this education and information piece. And I think what Josh presented today was really stark in that when customers were presented with a choice before the information, a large chunk of them acted differently once they were receiving that information. And I think that really reinforced the need that if we can tailor information to consumers, they will make rational decisions. And then when we do tailor that information, we've got to think about what's valuable for them rather than what's valuable for us on the supply side. So, you know, I think of my home, and I have all these appliances in the home. When I'm buying a fridge, a TV, a washing machine, a dishwasher, when I'm looking at the enablers within those equipment, it's how it makes my life easier. So when we're talking about whether it's a price or a mandated flexible export, how do we package that information up to the customer to say, this is how it's that price or that mandated export limit or import limit is going to make your life easier, is the critical bit of information we need to give to the customer so they can make an informed choice. So I think Josh's research really does reinforce some of the work we've done.
And I think, you know, in terms of the consumer education and understanding, it's how do you cast forward to what is coming and what does saturation of PV and EVs look like? It is really hard to imagine, but how we take that journey for them forward will be part of the future as well.
Yeah, I agree, Jean. I think solar is actually a really good lesson for us. On the back of some really good subsidies for the upfront end costs, some ongoing subsidies for feed-in tariffs, as well as an economic environment where consumers were happy with what they were getting in their bills from their retailers, it created this boom for solar. And we've got nearly 4 million households who have now adopted solar, and customers have taken control of their own generation, therefore consumption. So the next bit about how do we then say to these customers, there's more value for you through your solar and storage and, you know, moving your hot water around, things like that. That's the challenge for us, to keep it simple for those customers and make it about them and how it drives value for them.
Thank you, Con. We might change tack a little bit here. This is really the next stage of the discussion will be around, well, consumer energy resources are naturally linked to the system in which they operate within. So how do we work with that? And one of the questions I'd like to direct to you, Andrew, if that's all right, is if we can maintain this focus on consumers and their resources, what is needed to achieve integration into the distribution system, and what role will the distribution system have into the future with this direct connection?
Look, certainly, I would say that the distribution system plays an integral role, but not a solitary role in facilitating the uptake of greater uptake and orchestration and benefit from CER. Obviously, one of the key things, and was mentioned slightly by Josh, and it's come up a couple of times, I think, in the chat, is the tariff arrangements that are in place. And at the AEMC, we're just embarking on an important review, which is looking at electricity pricing for a consumer-driven future. So basically, what is the role that pricing plays in enabling the products and services that Josh has touched on, and we know is available now and in the future from the broader CER suite of packages. That can be both an enabler and a blocker, and it's not just the networks as well. There are others that will play a role, obviously retailers and other third parties that are taking advantage of the data that CER presents and the options around automation, whether that's in the home energy management system or with the direct for devices like batteries and EVs and space heating and water heating. But really, it's really trying to understand from the AEMC's perspective. We know that there's particularly from EVs. The impact on the grid is potentially very large, and so we want to obviously avoid the costs that come with a I guess with a disorganized CER uptake across electricity consumers, and making sure that we're maximising the utilisation of the existing investment that has gone into the poles and wires, whilst making sure that any increase that is required is done so at least cost. So this is where the opportunities of and we've seen it with examples like Project Edith, etc., where understanding how to get this optimized balance between time shifting, between coordination, between letting use the resources that they've invested in the way that they want to. It's definitely a complex challenge. It's a big challenge. It's why we're all here on this listening into this seminar today and contributing to it. That we don't know all the answers, but we know that there's more work that needs to be done, and it's through examples such as the research that Josh and the team are doing that we can start to sort of better unpack and understand how the different parts from the consumers all the way through to networks and generation can sort of work better together, and how things like the rules need to be changed, be optimized, be altered to make sure that we're not putting in place artificial barriers or constraints that will hinder the efforts and ultimately the benefits that will come.
Thanks, Andrew. Con, have you got a view on the role of the system and how it's viewed as from the end to end?
Yeah, I get back to the consumer. I mean, till 15 years ago, we used to come home, hit the light switch, and it worked. And that's the simplicity of the energy system, and it worked one way. I think consumers still want that simplicity when it comes to behind the meter products and services. So it's a real challenge for the market to keep that simplicity and get the customer involved in, well, if you make a purchase for solar and you've got your storage and you've got your EV, how do you still keep it simple? And it might not be as simple as hitting the light switch, but how do we use automation to allow the customer to have the car charging every third night at 11 p.m., which is, some of the trials that Arena's been running is something that customers are doing with no real problems once they understand that they can charge a car 11 p.m. every third night, and they've got enough power in that car to drive it to do kids drop off for schools, shopping requirements, get to work, things like that. So to me, in a two-way system, the theory or the concept of simplicity still remains important, and I don't think we want to overcomplicate it, which then brings in the third party and the role that third party plays as the agent of the customer for them to be able to explain to the customer how they can not only improve their own living conditions through adopting these products and services, but how that therefore then brings broader benefits, and that's that partial control and energy as a service that Josh explained. And that's the real complex stuff that we need to really simplify for the customer and say, there's additional value here for you, that it's not only valued for you, but actually brings value to the rest of the system. And that to me is the nut we need to crack. And the work that Andrew's talking about around consumer pricing is really important, because we don't want prices that the customer sees to be really complex, because I know when I go to the supermarket, I want to know what my milk costs when I buy it. And at the moment, energy is really hard. I'm not sure if you pick up your energy bill and you have a look at it, you've got about 3 or 4 different prices on there. You have to bring all together into a total cost of your bill. So to me, it's breaking that nut and keeping it simple for the customer, where the customer is more an active participant in the market.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go back to Andrew, because I'm just reflecting on what you were saying, Andrew. I wonder if there a way we need to think about or imagine the future markets. Is it going to be the same structure of the markets as we're at today, or do we need to think differently around how we're separating different parts of the market and delivering outcomes that we're looking for?
Oh, I think we certainly need to be thinking differently about the future. It's and this is one of the big challenges. It's how do we project into what the future looks like? And obviously, no one has a crystal ball, but we have some. I think we can make some fairly sound, basic assumptions about what the future will look like. But it's making the leap from looking to the future and working back in terms of what we need to be doing, rather than necessarily starting with these are the problems now and let's try and address them to get to a future solution. It's a bit of a nuance in that answer, but it's an important one. And again, I'll give another plug for our pricing review. That's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to gaze forward into 10, 15, 20 years into the future to understand what the system is going to be operating like, and very much putting the consumer lens on it of how will consumers get the greatest benefit from participating in that future. And so what do we need to be looking at changing along that journey over that time frame to enable that hopeful future reality to come to fruition.
Andrew. Brian, do you have any thoughts on the system and the way that the system will work with consumer energy resources and the role the system will have?
Sure. I've got a lot. I think, the others sort of touched on the direct impact to the consumer, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. But I think I'd like to talk, really, I think, about the distribution network. And I think that has a large impact into the pricing review and other things. So I think, there's this assumption that was even built into the research that increasing uptake of electric vehicles and electric appliances is a terrible outcome for the electricity grid, or is going to lead potentially to really big increases in bills and costs. I'm not sure that's true. And in fact, the research that Energy Consumers Australia did about a year ago with the CSIRO indicated that while there are costs from adding electric vehicles and electric appliances, increased costs to the distribution system, those are more than offset by increased usage of the system. So network utilization really goes up in an electrified future, even without a particularly large amount of control. And those flow through to benefits for all consumers, those who invest in electric technologies and those who don't, through lower on a per kilowatt basis, lower prices. So I think one of the things that's really important and missing, frankly, in the distribution system right now is really good data and transparency around costs. So if you really get deep into, the world of network tariffs, you get into this idea of what's a cost reflective tariff. That's not well defined. It's supposed to be based on the long run marginal cost of building capacity into the distribution system. That's also not defined. And if you just do an analysis today of where the distribution system sits, you find that by and large most of it is terribly underutilized. So this idea that actually we need to discourage consumers today from using too much electricity is kind of a story we've all told ourselves. But if you look at the data, it doesn't necessarily hold true. That is true in certain pockets of Australia, but by and large, it's not true.
There is a saying that the future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And when we think about that for CR adoption, how can what was being done can currently be promoted and used as a guide for the future? So how do we take some of those lessons of now into where we need to go, and that will then inform some of those thinkings around, well, how are we using energy, and what is the benefit of the investment that we're making, and how does that change our relationship with energy and the system? James, I'm just going to throw to you for a moment, just in relation to the enhanced system plan and where that's influencing our thinking here.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Might just comment on that the future is already here, but which was posed by Dan there. So thanks very much. Just first, if I can, just in that, something that we can learn, if we look at solar adoption now and everything, there is both the impact on the grid, but there is also that fairness question across all users, and that's both those who can't access solar and can't put it on, those who do have solar already in place, and those who are seeking access to solar now, but then have a different export arrangement to those who have preceded them because of starting to come up against some limits or whatever. And those limits are very, very foreseeable. Likewise, it's when you move to EV use and everything, that gets excessive. And yes, there's EV users now, and it has very little impact, if you like, locally on the grid. But it doesn't take many more to see that it does start coming in. So thinking of that fairness and thinking of these questions right now, we can see what's coming to us pretty soon. In terms of the ESP, more broadly, it's based in it's hunkered down in the physics elements of it, so that the flow mechanisms and everything, and where it hits. If we think of the challenges of the old system, if you like, of pushing out, we're now going to see that have to be addressed far more at a localized level, because what happens is where those nodes of constraint happen and how we think of the tools that we have in our kit bag to address them are fundamentally different when we've got storage distributed right through the system. And we're going to have masses of storage right through the system, just as I mentioned in the opening, just EVs alone. I think it's in Victoria, it's 300 gigawatt or whatever of storage. Now, that's not accessible all the time, okay? It's in cars and everything, but the potential is there. And if you create the right environment for consumers to engage where that works on their terms, there's got to be some sort of symbiotic opportunity there. I think the other element that we see through the enhanced system planning, and something that's burnt in our approach here, is very much that no two consumers are the same. So people are going to react in different ways. There's just groups of spectrums, just as we think of diversification of electricity users and their profiles that sit there. That diversification can work for us as well in terms of how we can think of system responses and the assets that are needed. I think probably just the last bit that I'd link to then is so we've got that thought of not just thinking of it up high and thinking of it at different levels. The questions of trying to where to optimize, as in the path through orchestration or the path through, build out more of the grid and provide even more consumer agency where they, you lessen that impact. Challenge is very few of us actually can quantify what the value of being connected to the grid is for us and what that communal benefit is. I think, certainly where Brian was going there on the utilisation aspect, utilisation, as we've spoken traditionally in the distribution grid, has all been around the design, the peak, and how we can shift that peak. And that's absolutely critical, because when you don't have storage, that's your only mechanism there. But it does change with storage. It becomes both the peak and the opportunity to utilise the assets that are in place already much better. And that's where I think a lot of the mass electrification, it's not a direct correlation to just, if we need double the flow through the energy system, that we need double the assets to do it, certainly in terms of value. It can be really, the chances to optimize are really quite high there. But consumers won't do it if they're not, if it's not done on their terms.
Thanks, James. I want to focus on the purpose of today's webinar, which is around orchestration for consumer benefit and interaction with the grid. And I want to explore what we're seeing at the moment in terms of where calculations through the ISP of the 4.1 billion, CEC's more recent number, which Con will talk about in a minute, where those benefits are flowing, and how do we carve up what we have as seeing the benefits from the system perspective to the consumer, or the communal benefit that we want to have as an outcome. How are we seeing that through those calculations and the amount of money that's being discussed as the benefit? Con, can I throw to you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And I saw there was a question in the chat about this as well, around the distribution benefits for the ISP work. So we were lucky enough when we did our study, the South Australian Power Network gave us access to their modelling work, and we asked them to model what would the impact be on the distribution network in South Australia from the difference between achieving the ISP step change versus achieving the CSIRO CSR forecast, which is one of the inputs that IEMA use for their work. And Sapin ran that through their model at a 95% service level, rather than having 100% built out capacity for the system. They did it at 95%, and then we aggregated that up. And the main difference between CSIRO and the ISP was there's a lot more uncontrolled solar coming into the system through the CSIRO modelling versus the ISP step change. The step change had a fair bit of orchestration. And uncontrolled solar obviously requires the networks then to invest into the system, and that cost to into the network system to enable that solar, the uncontrolled solar into the system, it costed about $2.4 billion, which is a significant amount of money. And that's the work hopefully IEMA will start to do in the future work that they do around ISP. But it's quite startling to the value of orchestration just on the distribution network. We also modelled the impact on the broader system, but that was, I think, the first time somebody's had a look at it and said, well, if we don't orchestrate this and get the levels of orchestration that IEMA are predicting in the step change, what does that actually mean for the distribution network? And yeah, as I said, it's about $2.5 billion. That's a big check for us consumers all to write, but something that if we put a bit of effort into, and our theory was if you got a $2.4 billion check, you could spend $2.4 billion and still be $100 million ahead. And you could put that into things like explaining to customers the value of orchestration, how they can participate. Not that we asked for $2.4 billion of savings, but that's the sort of the assumption. And that education is a really important part, education, information. And I know there was, just to finish up, somebody in the chat talked about education information. We actually looked into what that meant, and we didn't say it's education from people like us. People don't listen to people like us. We're energy nerds. We love this stuff. We talk about it day in, day out, but family and friends don't listen to us. They listen to trusted family members, trusted tradies. So a lot of our work around that education piece was to drill that money into those local communities where people trusted those advisors to provide the advice. So that's an important part of, it's not this big bang spending from the government to tell us all about why orchestration is valuable, but to drill that funding into the local community and get the local community trusted advisors to share that information with consumers.
Thanks, Con. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on how the benefits are going to flow through to the system, and who will receive those benefits and how?
Well, what we want to make sure is that the benefits are obviously shared as broadly as possible. And I think some of the recent work that the AEMC's done with our integrating price responsive resources and our unlock CER work shows that even for those for customers and consumers that don't have a lot of CER, have no CER, there are benefits that can accrue to them as well. So you don't need 100% uptake for this to occur, and it relates to that better network utilization and optimization, because ultimately you're getting a lower overall cost per customer to fund the network in that way. So it's certainly not a zero-sum game where everyone has to be maxing out their CER to derive these benefits. benefits. There are different levels, and we know again from the archetypes that that Joshua presented, there are always going to be customers that aren't able for whatever reason to invest in or have CER as part of their suite of tools that are available. And so really a lot of the focus also needs to be on that equity issue that's been mentioned, in terms of it can't just be how does all this done to benefit the adopters, but it's about how do we recognize and capture those benefits more broadly. And there are definitely the opportunities there. It's just another part of the challenge that we collectively need to be thinking about and doing to make sure that those benefits do get maximised.
Brian, that for Energy Consumers Australia's perspective, how do those benefits from your perspective flow through to not only the adopters but through the broader community?
Yeah, so as Andrew was saying, it's through better system utilization. It can even be better utilization of the existing generation fleet, right? So it is the poles and wires in the network, but it's also the generation fleet, making sure that you're not, oftentimes the biggest impact of demand response programs is just the reduction in peaker, in peak generation and the cost that can have on consumers. I think there's a couple things I would add to this conversation maybe. So the report that we did, the Stepping Up report, also looked at sort of the value of orchestration, of better orchestration of consumer devices, and we found similar numbers to the CEC. Off the top of my head, it was like 3.4 billion. We actually translated that into a per customer bill basis, like what was the actual uptake, so what from a customer perspective, and it came in at like 10 or 20 bucks a year, and so we didn't really publicize that result very heavily, like it's in the CSIRO report, mainly because these other impacts from electrification were so much more material. So not only for the participating customer, as we all know, right? If you buy an electric car, you're going to save a lot of money on petrol, and that's going to flow through to to the household's bottom line. But also that has not a $20 benefit on everybody else's electricity bill. It was more like $100 benefit on everybody's electricity bill, just from the adoption of electric vehicles, and the fact that, like, by their very nature, they tend to charge in a way that benefits the grid. And you don't have to take the CSIRO modeling at its word on that. You can look overseas and see in practice that has shown. So there's really good data that's come out of the US now about the downward pressure electric cars have put on electricity rates for everybody. So I guess the other thing I would add here, though, is that, like, so this fundamental question of to what degree does CER benefit everybody, we actually don't know, because the ISP doesn't ask that question or answer it. So the ISP makes assumptions about CER adoption, but it doesn't try to look at people's adoption of rooftop solar or household batteries as something that could compete against large-scale adoption of large-scale solar and large-scale batteries, and work out which is the most which is the best option for a least cost system overall. And so that was something that was flagged in the ISP review that the Commonwealth just did. Unfortunately, I think the Commonwealth decided not to pursue that in their rule changes, not because they don't think it's a good idea, but I think they think it's a bit premature, which might be right. But that does need to come into the thinking here, because it's often going to be cheaper to, instead of building new poles and wires and new large scale power plants, it will be built, cheaper to adopt more efficient appliances or to put solar on people's roof. But we have to have a better sense of, where the costs and benefits of those systems lie. And right now, we just haven't done the analysis to inform that.
Brian, that's really helpful in terms of ending where the sort of moderated questions will be. And we'll move to the open Q&A now. I want to encourage everyone to add their questions to the control panel on Zoom, the Q&A control panel. And we might switch now in saying that, do also pop your thoughts and reflections in the chat, because this is really about how we all as a sector move to the future. So if there's anything that we haven't thought about or we're not discussing, do pop it in there and we'll capture that and we'll reflect that in the future research outputs as well. Josh, I'll go back to you now with some of the questions that are coming through. We do have some questions around the market and mandated mechanisms, and in terms of how that was explained to the respondents, is there something that you were able to provide them that gave them a sense of what that meant?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it always gets down to the specifics of what you provide to participants as to how they actually evaluate and respond. If people are interested, really do encourage you to check out the report, but at a really high level, it was to paint a picture of what a market-based mechanism would look like. So in other words, your costs for electricity would increase or decrease as a function of the supply of demand in the grid. And for the mandated mechanism, really trying to put export and import dynamic operating envelopes into language that consumers are much more likely to understand, because it is a very technical consideration. And so again, really do encourage you, check out the report. You'll be able to look at the specific wording. I'm just going to mangle it if I try to do it from memory.
The report has been linked in the chat for the webinar, so if you can see it there, if not, it's on the C4Net website and we can circulate it after the webinar as well. I'm going to go to a question around consumers' trust and how trust comes into this discussion as well. And Con, I'll go to you to start with. It's an anonymous question, but how can consumers trust suppliers when the price they are paid for solar generation is dropping perhaps through the floor?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and it gets back to that piece about education. Like the midday price, because one of the success stories of solar is it's also means that in the middle of the day when we have too much solar, the value of that energy, because there's too much supply versus demand, has come down. And this is that education piece to explain to customers that solar has impacts on the system that need to be reflective in the price. And if we've got a lot of solar in the middle of the day, there's other solutions available for consumers, and that's where storage becomes important, because you can then store that solar, whether it's behind the meter or in front of the meter, store that solar and use it for peak periods. So the aim of this is obviously every household business has a load shape curve. The flatter we can make that load shape curve, the better that cost is for the system. And effectively, low feed-in tariffs in the middle of the day is reflective of a very successful uptake of solar by households, but that then needs the additionality of the storage to actually make that midday solar more valuable to the customers rather than reflecting its oversupply in the middle of the day.
Thank you. Andrew, in relation to some of the work that you're doing at the AEMC, you're looking at the different players within the market that we know of now, because we don't know everything into the future. So there's a question just in relation to third parties and how they might work with consumers to influence how CER's contribution to innovation and outcomes might be. Can you explain a little bit about the work you're doing there?
Yeah, certainly in terms of, and it relates to one of the answers I gave before, in terms of when we look forward, we don't necessarily know what the future is going to look like, but we've got some ideas, and we know that there are plenty of opportunities for not only the traditional players, the networks and the retailers, to be participating, offering products and services and solutions, but increasingly there'll be third parties. Now, whether they partner with retailers under white label arrangements or other things, or they're there just pitching their own business, their own business model, that we know they will be there. But it comes to again, partly what I think Con mentioned before is it's the availability of the data and that visibility that gives is going to be important for whomever a participant is, and it's also important for the consumers. We're doing a lot of work in terms of enabling better access to data, more real-time access to data, because a lot of what we're talking about, and particularly when we're talking about things like dynamic operating envelopes and being able to orchestrate devices, it all depends on knowing what's happening as much as possible, and that obviously presents its own challenges and issues. But knowing that being able to there'll be different elements. There'll be different elements, different parties that see an interest, have a solution, see opportunity to partner with users, whether they're at the household level, whether they're industrial and commercial businesses, to again optimize, deliver maximum benefit, reduce cost, increase return. That incentive is always going to be there. So understanding what the role is for each of the key parties, including the rules and the frameworks and the policy settings that will, as I said before, reduce the barriers or maximize the opportunities is always a key part of what we need to be looking at.
Andrew. There's a question in the chat from Peter Scott, and it relates to the education discussion we've been having or skirting around the edges of it. But I understand the advocacy for informing and educating consumers on the trade-offs of these decisions. But how do we propose that an education campaign will actually be effective, noting that consumers have generally demonstrated reluctance to engage in the increasing complexity of the market? Brian, have you got any thoughts on that?
I do. I had some thoughts on what Andrew just shared as well. But in terms of, so I think there's a lot of different things we need to think about when we're talking about educating consumers. So first of all, there's a need for just good, trusted advice. I think it's not even clear today when a customer buys a solar system that the information they're getting from the solar retailer, from the solar installer is 100% accurate and is honest as it could be. I think, we've just anecdotally heard a lot of stories about water heater replacements where customers are hearing, from the tradespeople that are installing those devices that, oh, you shouldn't, you really should stay with the gas appliance because the electricity grid can't handle the extra load or these other things. And so we really want to make sure that first and foremost that the information consumers are getting from the people that they do trust, like I think most consumers do trust their installers, probably trust installers slightly more, is accurate. But there is a fundamental lack of trust in the system. And, you can look through the ECA survey data to see that it's pretty overwhelming. And in fact, when you ask among, do you prefer your information from the retailer, from the government, from local council? It's just, I don't trust any of them. It's really like the overarching thing that comes through. So I think finding a trusted third-party independent source of information is really critical. I agree with some of the comments earlier that a lot of that's going to come through the community and your neighbors. And so it's really, I think, important that there's correct information out there. Stop there.
Thanks, Brian. Got a question from Heather Smith. It's related to the low voltage level where the optimization issues that are disconnected from our markets and from our tariffs. For example, whenever a transformer is constrained in imports and exports, users cannot access the wholesale market. They can only give or take locally. The transformer is therefore a collective asset, as is the orchestration system that optimises local use and generation. How much say do we think local people should have in the design of the optimisation system for their collective local assets? I'm happy to throw to anyone for that, but Con, if you'd like to start.
Wow, that is a decent question. I actually don't really know the answer to that. This is the bit like it gets into a bit of the discussion of community batteries is the same thing, right? And there's been a few trials. Victoria's run a few trials around neighbourhood batteries. They call them in Victoria. The Arena's done community batteries, and it's interesting how much I think there are a small percentage of the population who would like to be involved in that decision. I think that percentage is very small. I suspect it's less than 1% of the population that would like to get involved. And there's groups that are setting themselves up, like if I think of the Moreland Energy Foundation, groups like that who'd like to get involved. But I think that's a small proportion. I think most people would like us as the collective group here and listening today to optimise in their best interests. But I think there would be a few people on the fringe who would like more of a say in that optimisation. That's probably the best I can think of I just think most people, 99 point whatever percentage of population, just want it to work and want it to be the lowest cost possible.
I'm happy to take that, and I think there's a couple different things. So I think customers should have a greater say in the energy future. I take Con's point on this. I think he's right that most people don't care, and by and large, people, when you ask them what's their number one priority in the energy transition, they tell you affordability. So they want it to be reliable and cheap. We can't forget that. I think asking the questions in an effective way, which is a challenge. So if you just look at the way the AER Better Resets handbook has been implemented by networks, I think the networks have done really good work in getting better at engaging with customers to understand their preferences. I worry about that process sometimes, that it can be used to kind of misdirect consumers into things that maybe that sound good, but they don't really understand the cost implications for. I say that I legitimately wonder. I'm not certain how it works out one way or the other. But on this point that Heather raises, I think it's a really important one, and it's one where we're failing local communities today. So I think I'm in Sydney today, but I live in Newcastle, and just like in Moreland, there's a community in Newcastle, Electrify Ties Hill, that's quite focused on what's going to happen in their local suburb. And those people should absolutely have an avenue to communicate with the local networks. I think the networks just have not really identified this as a need historically, and so don't really have the staff or the people or the expertise to do it effectively. I think that needs to happen. And then I guess the other point I've been waiting to make here is around this need for data and data transparency. So Con brought up community batteries, which I think is a great example. EV charging would be another example. So you've got these experiences today where the distribution networks are looking to invest in community batteries and in EV charging, and that's great. I'm not against either of those things, but what the system allows right now is a amazing information asymmetry between the networks and the rest of the market in terms of those solutions. So you want to build a community battery, it's going to be, the business case is going to be built upon what it can do for the local grid. Only the local distribution network knows that information, and they have no requirement to share it with anyone else. Similarly, with where EV charging goes, hopefully everybody can kind of identify the best parts of or anyone could identify the best parts of the road infrastructure to figure out where EV chargers should go. But where on the grid there's excess capacity to accept EV charging, right now that's only known by the distribution networks. If they even know, there's also the chance that they might not even know that. So they need to get more informed, and then they need to tell everybody. And one of the great things I think about the Enhanced System project and the work that C4Net is doing is that you're building towards those skills and capabilities.
Yeah, I might just throw to James, because it does link very closely with the Enhanced System Plan and what we are trying to do.
So probably two things. One is that localization element. That's sort of what I was talking about there. You want to make, while local issues can come up very acutely, you want to make sure that the system is in place to be able to deal with that, and to have, you want to make sure that you're not doing one solution in one spot that knocks out the next door neighbor in the next spot, type thing, so that you can have those really quite localized issues, because they can sprout up. But the other bit is they can happen quite dynamically. Issues are going to happen a lot more dynamically. We've now got a lot more levers there that can both cause issues but also address those issues. And so from thinking of the system planning type of thing, that's where we're thinking through to what is that grid of the future? What are the capabilities of the grid, of the DSO who will be operating those bits or trying to balance out? Because the more that they can do it in a way that lowers cost, that's where all consumers will win.
Thank you. I'm just going to throw a question back to Josh now. It's related to a question from Peter Ross. Did the research consider the longer term probability that the market will invert and consumers will become generators and the market will be a minimal peak levelling system dynamically priced? I'll come back to others on that one as well, but Josh first.
Long story short, no. I think it is a really interesting one to look at, and would be wonderful to start seeing what consumers might start to do for their own household investment decisions. But long story short, we didn't look at that as part of this research.
And Janine, while that consumer element didn't hear, and I think it was entirely appropriate, Josh, there not to, the rest in the rest of the enhanced system plan, because we do look out to that 2050, 30 years from now. Yes, that's what the step change scenario in the ISP tells us now, is it has inverted. And so those things do play through, and we're looking at those impacts.
Does anyone anything to add to that in terms of their thoughts around where that future will go?
I think that I agree with James. That's kind of where things are going to. But in order to achieve that in the best possible way, it does depend on maximising the benefits around things like orchestration and making sure that as much of that locally generated and stored power can be put back into the grid and taken out of the grid at the right times to achieve that outcome. So whilst it's definitely a future scenario that can be thought about and aimed for, I don't necessarily think the answer actually changes what we're talking about here. It's all about trying to get the best, lowest cost solution to maximise the benefits across the customer base, across the consumer base, for the benefit of the system as a whole.
Maybe just to add to that, Sandra, I think you made the comment, Janine, before the future's here. There's probably at least 2 market participants I can think of who are trying to do that, even when we don't have this full suite of revenue streams available. I think the price responsive work that the AMC is finalising, I think, will unlock additional revenue streams, which I think will potentially bring more new entrants to the market. But there's 2 that I can think of now that I've got a business model where they're trying to do that. So I think it is here, it is happening, not at the scale we probably want to see though.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time and we have only got a few minutes left. I just want to go around to each of you. There is a question on the chat. What are the 3 actions you would take now to optimise existing and future distributed assets or consumer energy resources? Where Brian, I could start with you if you've got a moment.
Sure. So I would fundamentally reform distribution system planning. That would be the first thing I would do. I mean, I think if you look at the integrated system plan that was first identified as a need in the 2017 Finkel review, and the number of variations that's gone through, and the value of the transmission asset base is about, or the value of the distribution network is about 3.5 times bigger than the transmission network. And yet we don't plan distribution half as well as we plan transmission. We don't plan it for more than 5 years, really, because the DAPR, the distribution annual planning review, and the 5-yearly resets don't require networks to look further than that. To Heather's point, we don't really engage local communities in that planning. We do a little bit in those 5-yearly resets, but outside of that, we don't. We don't provide the data and the information about the networks transparently to all market players so that they understand where community batteries or EV charging might go best. So I think that's one big thing I would do. I think the other thing I would do is I would like to see very dynamic, very cost-reflective locational tariffs that are completely optional. So what I mean there is network tariffs, things that demonstrate the true minute-on-minute health of the network in any given part of the network, but that no one has to take up. And presumably then the only people who would take those up are actual devices or people with devices like batteries or EV chargers that want to use that type of dynamic control. So that's 2. Somebody else can have the 3rd.
I'm happy to jump in, and I won't repeat Brian's. I think they're both important. The one I've spoken a bit about today, education information. I won't go into that too much more, but I think that's important. That if we build the supply side, we need to ensure that customers understand how that supply side works for them, and so we need to do that. And the one thing that we've identified in our work we did, which we haven't discussed today, is government themselves. And government are the biggest owners of land and assets in Australia, and they can show real leadership here by electrifying their assets. So Department of Defence is the biggest owner of housing, schools, hospitals, local councils, swimming pools. They could, our view is that there's some not easy, but better, easier ways to electrify those assets and show leadership in the community and show others in the community by putting or electrifying those assets and making that energy more flexible and sharing that energy and the benefits of it with the local community is an important step. So I think there's a real role here for governments to show leadership and take on the role of saying, not only are we wanting customers to put solar and battery and get EVs, but we're going to do it with our own assets to lead the way.
Thanks, Con. Andrew.
Look, yeah, I certainly agree with what Brian and Con have said there, and I'll similarly on the government side, the market cannot solve everything. There is definitely a role for policy to be playing a role. I know there was a question in there about how do we get landlords to invest in CER? Through increasing efficiency standards, through other mechanisms. There are other levers that are very complementary that also need to be pulled, because the market can only go so far in terms of getting to where we need to go to. And I think now that we have the CER roadmap that's been released with the various work streams that come under that, both technical and others, particularly around, say, DSO type operations, which goes, I think, a bit to Brian's point around there needs to be a lot more focus. I agree, there needs to be a lot more focus on the thinking and the design and the optimization of the distribution network in terms of the system planning. That there's that equivalent of an ISP for the distribution system is definitely a view that is gaining a lot of support, I think. And so working in that space, along with the being very clear about what the energy system, the rules, the frameworks can't do, that policymakers need to take an equivalent amount of responsibility for is key to achieving the outcomes that we've been talking about today.
Thank you. I'm just very conscious of time. We're running at the end of the webinar, so I want to really thank all the attendees for your engagement and your attendance today, but also the panelists. Really appreciate your insights. This is a really complex but very important and emerging discussion that we need to be having, and we need to be really getting a plan for going forward, so we have a sense of where the future is going to land, but also what we need to do to prepare for that. Thanks for your attendance. We have another webinar set for the 18th of September, talking about the enhanced system plan and where that's going for a whole system energy planning approach, and we encourage you to join that discussion. But I'll let you all go now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Janine.